thought she was saving a stranger's life. But when the fever broke and the headlines hit, everything changed. Who is he really? And why did fate bring him to her door? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The rain fell in sheets across Boston's cobblestone streets that November evening in 1898, turning the gaslights into hazy golden orbs that barely penetrated the gathering darkness. Margaret Sullivan stood at the window of her modest brownstone apartment on Beacon Hill, watching the storm intensify with growing concern. As a private nurse, she had seen her share of desperate situations, but something about this particular evening felt different, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the lightning crackling across the sky. She had just finished preparing a light supper when the frantic pounding on her door shattered the quiet. Margaret's heart raced as she hurried to answer, her practical navy dress swishing around her ankles. When she opened the door, she found a drenched young man supporting another figure, whose head lolled forward unconsciously. "Please, miss," the young man gasped, his face pale with exhaustion and rain streaming from his cap. "My employer. He collapsed on the street. The doctor said he needs immediate care, and Mrs. Pemberton from the corner shop told me you're a nurse. He's burning with fever and I don't know what else to do." Margaret's trained eyes assessed the unconscious man quickly. He was tall, powerfully built, with dark hair plastered to his forehead by rain and sweat. His fine wool coat and quality boots spoke of means, but his pallor and the heat radiating from him even at a distance told her everything she needed to know. "Bring him in quickly," she commanded, already moving to clear her small sitting room. "Set him on the sofa there. What's your name?" "Timothy, miss. Timothy Walsh. I'm Mr. Hartwell's assistant." The young man carefully lowered his employer onto the worn but clean sofa, his hands shaking from cold and fear. "And his full name?" Margaret was already fetching her medical supplies, her mind cataloging symptoms and necessary treatments. "Jonathan Hartwell, miss. We were investigating a case near the docks when he suddenly fell ill. It came on so fast, within just a few hours." Margaret knelt beside the unconscious man, pressing her hand to his forehead. The heat was intense, dangerous. She had seen fevers like this before, remembered too well how quickly they could turn fatal. Working swiftly, she loosened his collar and began to remove his wet outer garments while maintaining his modesty with practiced efficiency. "Timothy, I need you to fetch me ice from the ice house 2 streets over, as much as they can spare. Then go to Dr. Morrison's office on Charles Street and tell him Margaret Sullivan has a patient with severe fever and possible pneumonia. Can you do that?" "Yes, miss. Right away." Timothy hesitated at the door, looking back at his employer with worried eyes. "He's a good man, Miss Sullivan. One of the best. Please help him." "I'll do everything I can," Margaret assured him, though her expression remained grave. "Now hurry." As the door closed behind Timothy, Margaret turned her full attention to her unexpected patient. Jonathan Hartwell, she thought, studying his face as she worked to make him comfortable. Even in his fevered state, there was something striking about him, a strength in the line of his jaw, an intelligence suggested by the furrow between his dark brows. She estimated him to be perhaps 30 years old, in the prime of his life, and wondered what case had brought him to the dangerous dock district in such weather. She worked through the night, sponging his burning skin with cool water, changing the compresses on his forehead, monitoring his labored breathing. Dr. Morrison arrived near midnight, examined the patient thoroughly, and left additional medicine with grave instructions. "It's pneumonia, Margaret, as you suspected. The next 48 hours will be critical. If the fever doesn't break, I fear the worst. But if anyone can pull him through, it's you. Your skill is exceptional, and he's fortunate to have found his way to your door." Margaret barely slept over the following 2 days and nights. She sat vigil beside Jonathan, administering medicine at precise intervals, keeping his fever at bay with cool compresses, propping him up when his breathing became too labored. Timothy returned periodically with supplies and messages, but Margaret sent him away to rest, insisting she could manage alone. During the long, quiet hours, Jonathan occasionally muttered in his delirium fragments of sentences that painted a picture of the man beneath the illness. He spoke of justice, of truth that must be found, of someone named Victoria who mustn't be blamed. He called out warnings about documents and danger, his strong hands grasping at the air as if reaching for evidence just beyond his grasp. Margaret found herself fascinated despite the professional distance she usually maintained. There was passion in his fevered words, a dedication to whatever cause drove him. She bathed his forehead gently, murmuring reassurances she wasn't certain he could hear, telling him he was safe, that he must rest and heal. On the third morning, as pale November sunlight filtered through her lace curtains, Margaret sat in the chair beside the sofa, her head drooping with exhaustion. She had been awake for nearly 36 hours straight, monitoring every breath, every change in his condition. The fever had finally begun to subside near dawn, and she had allowed herself to rest for just a moment. A soft sound startled her awake. Margaret's eyes flew open to find Jonathan Hartwell looking at her with clear, conscious eyes for the first time. They were a remarkable shade of blue-gray, like the ocean before a storm, and they regarded her with confusion and something else, something warmer. "Where am I?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but lucid. Margaret sat up quickly, pressing her hand to his forehead. The fever had indeed broken, leaving him weak but finally out of danger. Relief flooded through her with such intensity that she had to steady herself. "You're safe, Mr. Hartwell. You're in my home on Beacon Hill. I'm Margaret Sullivan, a nurse. You've been quite ill with pneumonia for 3 days. Jonathan attempted to sit up but fell back with a groan. 3 days? That's impossible. I was at the warehouse, following a lead on the Bancroft case, and then, he frowned, trying to piece together fragmented memories. Timothy. Where's Timothy? Your assistant is fine. He's been checking on you regularly, but I sent him to rest. You collapsed from fever, and he brought you here for care. Margaret poured a glass of water from the pitcher on the side table. Here, drink this slowly. You're still very weak. Jonathan accepted the water gratefully, studying Margaret as he drank. Even in her exhaustion, with her chestnut hair escaping its pins and dark circles under her green eyes, she was beautiful. There was a strength in her face, an intelligence and competence that intrigued him beyond the simple gratitude he felt for his life. You saved my life, he said quietly, setting down the empty glass. Timothy told me before I lost consciousness that we were going to a nurse named Sullivan. I remember thinking how fortunate that was, and then nothing until now. You're not fully recovered yet, Mr. Hartwell. The pneumonia was severe, and you'll need several more days of rest before you should even consider leaving this sofa. Margaret stood, smoothing her rumpled dress. I'll prepare some broth. You need to regain your strength gradually. Please, call me Jonathan. He caught her hand as she moved past him, the gesture gentle but stopping her in her tracks. And thank you, Miss Sullivan. Truly, I understand what 3 days and nights of care means. The dedication required. I'm in your debt. Margaret felt warmth spread through her at his touch, his sincerity. She gently withdrew her hand, professional propriety warring with an unexpected flutter in her chest. It's my calling, Mr. Hartwell. I'm simply grateful the fever broke. Now rest while I prepare food. Doctor's orders. As she moved to her small kitchen, Margaret found her hands trembling slightly. She told herself it was merely exhaustion, the natural aftermath of such an intense period of care. But she couldn't deny the way her heart had jumped when those storm-colored eyes had focused on her, clear and aware and grateful. Jonathan watched her go, his mind already racing despite his physical weakness. The Bancroft case, he had to remember the details, but his thoughts kept returning to the woman who had saved his life, to her gentle hands and determined care. He had a vague memory of her voice in his fever dreams, an anchor in the chaos, promising he would be well. The afternoon passed quietly. Margaret brought him broth and bread, helping him sit up enough to eat without strain. Jonathan's strength was returning slowly, but he remained weak, frustrated by his body's limitations. He was a man of action, accustomed to long days of investigation and pursuit of truth. This enforced rest chafed at him. Tell me about yourself, Miss Sullivan, Jonathan requested as Margaret adjusted his pillows. I feel I know so little about the woman who's been my guardian angel these past days. Margaret hesitated, unused to personal questions from patients. But something in Jonathan's genuine interest encouraged her to answer. There's little to tell that would interest you, Mr. Hartwell. I'm a private nurse, trained at Boston City Hospital. I've been practicing for 5 years now, since I was 20. I live alone and manage quite well. No family? Jonathan asked gently, sensing a story beneath her matter-of-fact tone. My parents passed when I was 18. A factory fire. After that, I decided to make myself useful, to help others. Nursing gave me purpose and independence. Margaret met his eyes steadily, her chin lifting slightly. I'm quite content with my life. Jonathan heard the defensive pride in her voice and understood it. I meant no disrespect. Independence is admirable, Miss Sullivan. I imagine it takes considerable courage for a woman alone in the city. And what of you, Mr. Hartwell? Margaret asked, deflecting attention from herself. Your assistant mentioned you were investigating a case. Are you with the police? Private detective, Jonathan corrected, a hint of passion entering his weak voice. I was a police detective for several years, but I found the constraints of the department limiting. Too much politics. Too many cases closed for convenience rather than justice. 2 years ago, I established my own agency. I take cases others won't touch. Find truths that powerful people would prefer remain hidden. Margaret felt her interest deepen. That sounds dangerous and lonely. Both, Jonathan admitted, but necessary. The Bancroft case, the one I was investigating when I fell ill, it involves a young woman falsely accused of theft from her employer. The evidence against her is circumstantial, but her employer is influential, and the police have already decided her guilt. I was following a lead at the warehouse district that might prove her innocence when the fever took me. How noble, Margaret said, and she meant it. There was no sarcasm in her tone, only admiration. To fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. Jonathan looked at her intently. Is that not what you do as well, Miss Sullivan? You fight for life when it hangs in the balance. We're not so different, you and I. Their eyes met and held, and Margaret felt something shift between them, a recognition of kindred spirits. She looked away first, standing abruptly. You should rest now, Mr. Hartwell. Too much excitement isn't good for recovery. Over the following days, as Jonathan's strength gradually returned, an easy companionship developed between them. Margaret continued her vigilant care, but now they talked for hours, sharing stories of their lives and work. Jonathan told her of his cases, of the satisfaction of uncovering truth and securing justice. Margaret spoke of her patience, of the profound intimacy of caring for others in their most vulnerable moments. Timothy visited daily, bringing Jonathan's correspondence and updates on the Bancroft case. The young woman had been formally charged and was awaiting trial. Jonathan fretted at his confinement, desperate to continue his investigation, but Margaret was firm about his need for rest. Your dedication does you credit, Mr. Hartwell, but you'll be no use to anyone if you relapse, she told him sternly on the 5th day, when she found him trying to stand on his own. You must trust that a few more days of recovery won't destroy your case. Please call me Jonathan, he said again, steadying himself against the sofa. We've moved well beyond formality, haven't we, Margaret? The use of her given name sent a pleasant warmth through her. Very well, Jonathan, but you must promise to follow my instructions. No attempting to leave this apartment until I clear you. I promise, Jonathan agreed, settling back with better grace. Though I confess the inactivity is maddening. I'm unaccustomed to idleness. Margaret smiled at his frustration, understanding it well. Then let me bring you your case files. Perhaps reviewing what you know will help organize your thoughts for when you're well enough to resume your investigation. Jonathan's face brightened considerably. Would you? That would be immensely helpful. Timothy can bring them this afternoon. When Timothy arrived later with a leather satchel full of documents, Jonathan spread them across Margaret's small dining table with an enthusiasm that belied his recent illness. Margaret found herself drawn to the materials, her curiosity piqued by the neat handwriting and careful observations that filled the pages. May I? She asked, gesturing to the papers. Of course, Jonathan said, moving some documents so she could see better. Fresh eyes might catch something I've missed. The case concerns Miss Victoria Prescott, a young woman employed as a companion to Mrs. Helena Bancroft, widow of the industrialist Robert Bancroft. 3 weeks ago, a diamond bracelet valued at nearly $5,000 disappeared from Mrs. Bancroft's jewelry box. Victoria was the only person besides Mrs. Bancroft who had access to the room, or so the household claims. Margaret studied a photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She doesn't look like a thief. Appearances can deceive, Jonathan said carefully, but in this case, I believe they don't. Victoria has been with the Bancroft household for 2 years, with an impeccable record. She came highly recommended from her previous position with the Ashworth family in New York. Why would she suddenly risk everything for a bracelet? Perhaps she needed money desperately, Margaret suggested, playing devil's advocate as she examined the police report. That was my first thought as well, but I investigated her circumstances thoroughly. Her salary is modest but adequate. She has no debts, no expensive habits, and she regularly sends money to her younger sister, who attends a teaching college in Philadelphia. Her character references are sterling. Nothing suggests a woman who would commit such a crime. Margaret looked up from the papers. Then who did take the bracelet? That's precisely what I was investigating at the warehouse district when the fever struck me. Jonathan pulled out a notebook, flipping through pages of observations. Mrs. Bancroft's nephew, Charles Whitmore, has been managing her late husband's business affairs. I discovered he's been making some questionable financial decisions, investments that have lost considerable money. I suspected he might have access to the house and an opportunity to take the bracelet, planning to pawn it discreetly to cover his losses. And your investigation at the warehouse? Margaret prompted, her interest thoroughly engaged now. I received an anonymous tip that Charles had been seen near a particular pawn shop in the Dock District, one known for handling items without asking too many questions. I was attempting to verify this information when I collapsed. Jonathan's frustration was evident in his voice. The trial is set for next week. If I don't find proof of Charles's involvement soon, Victoria will be convicted and imprisoned. Margaret felt a surge of sympathy for the unseen young woman whose fate hung in the balance. There must be something we can do, some way to continue the investigation even while you recover. Jonathan looked at her with surprise and something warmer, admiration perhaps. We? Margaret, I couldn't possibly ask you to involve yourself in something potentially dangerous. You're not asking. I'm offering. Margaret's green eyes flashed with determination. I have some freedom during the day, and I know the city well. With your guidance, I could make inquiries that wouldn't raise suspicion. A woman asking questions attracts less attention than a known detective. Jonathan studied her for a long moment, seeing not just the capable nurse who had saved his life, but a woman of courage and compassion who was willing to risk herself for a stranger's cause. You're remarkable, Margaret Sullivan. She felt heat rise to her cheeks at the intensity of his gaze. I simply believe in justice, as you do. Now tell me about this pawn shop and what information you need. They spent the remainder of the evening planning Margaret's investigation. Jonathan was thorough in his instructions, detailing what questions to ask, what to observe, and most importantly, what dangers to avoid. Margaret listened intently, her quick mind grasping the nuances of detective work with impressive speed. The shop is called Morrison's Fine Goods, though there's nothing fine about it, Jonathan explained, sketching a rough map of the Dock District. The proprietor is a man named Samuel Kern. He's careful, never handles anything obviously stolen, but he has connections to less scrupulous dealers. If Charles Whitmore did pawn the bracelet, Kern would know about it, even if he wasn't the direct recipient. And how should I approach him? Margaret asked, studying the map. Carefully. Say you're inquiring on behalf of an employer who had a piece go missing and heard Kern might know of its whereabouts. Keep it vague. Feel him out. He's more likely to talk to a respectable woman than he would be to me, especially if he thinks there might be a reward involved. Jonathan reached across the table, his hand covering hers. But Margaret, promise me you'll be cautious. If anything feels wrong, leave immediately. The warmth of his hand on hers made Margaret's pulse quicken. I promise, I'm not foolish, Jonathan. I'll take every precaution. The next morning, Margaret dressed carefully in her second-best walking dress, a deep green wool that was respectable, but not ostentatious, and pinned her hat securely. She left Jonathan with strict instructions to rest and not attempt anything strenuous, though the knowing look in his eyes suggested he understood exactly how difficult following that advice would be for a man of his temperament. The Dock District was a world away from Beacon Hill's genteel streets. The November wind carried the sharp scent of the harbor, mixed with coal smoke and the indefinable smell of commerce and poverty intertwined. Margaret kept her shoulders back and her expression confident as she navigated the crowded streets, aware of the curious glances her quality clothing attracted in this neighborhood. Morrison's Fine Goods was squeezed between a tavern and a ship chandler's shop, its windows dusty and displaying a haphazard collection of items that ranged from pocket watches to musical instruments. Margaret took a steadying breath and pushed open the door, a bell tinkling overhead. The interior was dim and cluttered, every surface covered with merchandise of varying quality and provenance. Behind a scarred wooden counter stood a thin man with shrewd eyes and graying hair slicked back with pomade. "Good morning, madam," Samuel Kern said, his voice obsequious but his eyes calculating. "How may I assist you today? Perhaps you're looking for a gift? I have some lovely pieces just arrived." Margaret approached the counter with measured confidence. "Good morning, Mr. Kern. I'm here on behalf of my employer, Mrs. Thornton. She had a bracelet go missing from her home several weeks ago, a diamond piece of considerable sentimental value. We've heard you're a man who knows things, who might be aware if such an item had found its way into certain channels." Kern's expression became guarded. "I run a legitimate establishment, madam. I don't deal in stolen goods." "Of course not," Margaret said smoothly. "I'm not suggesting you do, but you're a businessman with connections throughout the city. Mrs. Thornton is prepared to offer a substantial reward for information leading to the bracelet's recovery. No questions asked. She cares only about retrieving her late mother's gift." The mention of a reward caused a flicker of interest in Kern's eyes. What did this bracelet look like? Margaret described the Bancroft bracelet as Jonathan had detailed it to her. Watching Kern's reaction carefully, she saw recognition flash across his face before he schooled his features back to neutrality. "Can't say I've seen anything matching that description," Kern said, but his voice had changed slightly, become more cautious. "But I'll keep my ears open. Where can Mrs. Thornton be reached if I hear anything?" Margaret had prepared for this. She gave him the address of a boarding house run by an acquaintance, a place where messages could be left discreetly. "Any information would be greatly appreciated, Mr. Kern. The reward is $500. She saw the greed spark in his eyes at the sum and knew she had him hooked. Kern would make inquiries now, trying to locate the bracelet so he could claim the reward. And in making those inquiries, he might reveal connections that would prove Charles Whitmore's guilt. As Margaret turned to leave, Kern called out, "This Mrs. Thornton. She's certain the bracelet was stolen. Sometimes valuables get misplaced, turn up in unexpected places." Margaret looked back at him steadily. She's quite certain it was taken by someone who had access to her private rooms. Someone she trusted, which makes the betrayal all the more painful. She left the shop feeling both triumphant and uneasy. Kern had definitely recognized the bracelet's description, which meant it had passed through his network. But the way he had asked about whether it was definitely stolen suggested he knew more than he was saying, perhaps even knew who had brought it to be sold. Margaret spent the rest of the morning making discreet inquiries at neighboring shops, posing as a woman looking for directions or information about the area. She learned that Charles Whitmore had indeed been seen in the district several times over the past month, always alone and always seeming nervous, out of place in his fine clothing. When she returned to her apartment that afternoon, she found Jonathan sitting up properly for the first time, dressed in a shirt and trousers Timothy had brought. His color was much improved, and though he still looked thin from his illness, the strength was returning to his frame. "You're looking much better," Margaret observed, removing her hat and gloves. "And you're looking pleased with yourself," Jonathan countered with a slight smile. "Your mission was successful?" Margaret sat down and related everything that had happened, her observations and impressions. Jonathan listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, his respect for her abilities evident in his attention. "You did brilliantly," he said when she finished. "Kern's reaction confirms my suspicions. He knows about the bracelet, which means it was pawned through his network. Now we need to prove Charles Whitmore was the one who brought it to him." "How do we do that?" Margaret asked. Jonathan stood carefully, testing his strength. "We need to catch Charles in the act of retrieving money from the pawn. Kern will contact him now that there's interest and a potential buyer willing to pay. Charles will want to conclude the transaction quickly, get his money before questions are asked." "But you're not well enough for surveillance work," Margaret protested. "I will be in a few days," Jonathan assured her, "and Timothy can assist. Margaret, you've done more than I could have hoped. I can't ask you to involve yourself further." But Margaret found herself reluctant to step away from the case now. Over the past days, working alongside Jonathan, she had felt a sense of purpose beyond her nursing duties, a thrill of pursuing justice that resonated with something deep within her. And if she was honest with herself, she wasn't ready to say goodbye to Jonathan Hartwell, to return to her solitary life now that he was recovering. "What if I don't want to step away?" she said quietly. "What if I want to see this through, to ensure Victoria Prescott gets the justice she deserves. Jonathan crossed to where she sat, his movements still careful but stronger. He knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Margaret, you've already given me so much. You saved my life, opened your home to a stranger, and now you've advanced my investigation when all seemed lost. I can't put you at further risk. The risk is mine to take, Margaret said, her heart racing at his proximity, at the warmth of his hands holding hers. I'm not a fragile flower, Jonathan. I've faced death in sick rooms, dealt with difficult patients and desperate situations. I can handle whatever this investigation requires. Jonathan looked into her green eyes and saw the determination there, the courage and strength that had first drawn his admiration. But he also saw something else, something that mirrored the feeling growing in his own chest, an attraction that went beyond gratitude or professional respect. You're extraordinary, he said softly. I realized that while fighting through the fever. Your voice was an anchor, pulling me back when I might have drifted away. I heard you, Margaret, every word of comfort and encouragement. You saved me not just with medicine, but with your presence, your refusal to let me give up. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at his words. I couldn't let you die. From the moment Timothy brought you to my door, I felt something, a connection I couldn't explain. I've cared for many patients, but never have I felt such desperate determination to save someone. They remained like that for a long moment, hands clasped, eyes locked, the air between them charged with unspoken emotion. Then Jonathan stood, drawing her up with him, maintaining his hold on her hands. Then we'll see this through together, he said. But carefully, methodically, with every precaution. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of my case. The next 2 days passed in a flurry of planning and preparation. Jonathan's strength continued to improve, and by the 3rd day after Margaret's visit to the pawn shop, he was well enough to resume limited activity. Timothy reported that Charles Whitmore had been seen returning to the dock district, and Jonathan knew their window of opportunity was closing. On a cold afternoon in late November, Margaret found herself standing in the shadows of an alley across from Morrison's Fine Goods, wrapped in a dark cloak that concealed her figure. Jonathan stood beside her, his presence both reassuring and unsettling in ways that had nothing to do with the danger of their surveillance. Timothy was positioned at the other end of the street, ready to follow if Charles Whitmore appeared, and departed before they could intercept him. Are you certain you're well enough for this? Margaret whispered, studying Jonathan's profile in the dim light. Though his color had returned and his strength was much improved, she worried about the exertion of standing in the cold after such a severe illness. I'm quite recovered, thanks to your excellent care, Jonathan assured her, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. And I wouldn't miss this for anything. Victoria Prescott's freedom depends on what happens in the next few hours. They had been waiting for nearly 2 hours when a hired carriage pulled up before the pawn shop. A well-dressed man in his early 30s emerged, glancing nervously up and down the street before hurrying inside. Even from a distance, Margaret could see the anxiety in his movements, the way his hand trembled slightly as he pushed open the door. That's Charles Whitmore, Jonathan confirmed quietly, his body tensing with focus. Now we wait and see what transpires. Inside the shop, Samuel Kern greeted Charles with barely concealed contempt. The contrast between Kern's obsequious manner with Margaret and his cold demeanor with Charles spoke volumes about the nature of their relationship. You're late, Whitmore, Kern said, not bothering with pleasantries. I told you to come yesterday. There's been someone asking questions about a diamond bracelet matching the description of the piece you brought me. Charles's face went pale. What? Who? The police? No, some woman claiming to represent an employer who lost a bracelet, offered a reward for information. Kern leaned against his counter, eyes calculating. Thing is, the bracelet you sold me, you said it was your aunt's, that she'd given it to you to sell for her because she needed cash discreetly. That's right, Charles said quickly, too quickly. My aunt, Mrs. Bancroft. She didn't want the household to know about her financial difficulties. Funny thing, Kern continued, his voice hardening. I did some checking after that woman left. Turns out Mrs. Helena Bancroft reported a diamond bracelet stolen from her home, and her companion has been arrested for the theft. Now, I may not be particular about where my merchandise comes from, but I don't deal in stolen goods that are going to bring police attention to my establishment. Charles's panic was evident now, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. I can explain. There's been a misunderstanding. My aunt did give me the bracelet, The companion must have confused things, accused herself out of guilt or confusion. Save your lies, Kern snapped. I want you out of my shop, and I want my money back. The bracelet's already been sold to a private collector in New York, and if this mess comes back on me, I'll make sure the police know exactly who brought me that stolen jewelry. Outside, Jonathan had positioned himself near the shop's entrance, ready to confront Charles when he emerged. Margaret stood slightly behind him, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. She had never done anything like this before, never deliberately placed herself in a potentially dangerous situation, but the thought of Victoria Prescott languishing in jail for a crime she didn't commit steeled her resolve. The shop door burst open and Charles Whitmore practically stumbled out, his face flushed with anger and fear. He made it 3 steps before Jonathan moved to block his path. "Mr. Whitmore," Jonathan said calmly, though his voice carried unmistakable authority. "I think we need to have a conversation about Mrs. Bancroft's missing bracelet." Charles's eyes widened in recognition and terror. "Hartwell, the detective. I heard you'd fallen ill, that the case was suspended. As you can see, reports of my incapacitation were premature." Jonathan's stance was relaxed but ready, his years of police work evident in the way he commanded the space. "I have a witness who will testify that you sold a diamond bracelet matching the exact description of your aunt's stolen jewelry to Samuel Kern. I have evidence of your financial troubles, your desperate need for cash to cover investment losses, and I have testimony from multiple sources placing you in this district repeatedly over the past weeks." "You can't prove anything," Charles said, but his voice lacked conviction. His eyes darted around, looking for escape routes, but Timothy had moved to block the other end of the alley. "I can prove enough to establish reasonable doubt about Victoria Prescott's guilt," Jonathan countered, "and once doubt is established, a thorough investigation of your finances and activities will reveal the truth. You took the bracelet during one of your visits to your aunt's house, knowing Victoria would be blamed because of her access to the room. You thought yourself clever, but you were merely cruel and desperate." Margaret watched Charles's face as the truth of his situation settled over him. She saw the moment his defiance crumbled, replaced by defeated recognition of his exposure. His shoulders sagged, and he suddenly looked much older than his 30-odd years. "My aunt will never forgive me," Charles said quietly, almost to himself. "The Bancroft name, my reputation, everything will be destroyed." "Your reputation was destroyed the moment you allowed an innocent woman to be arrested for your crime," Margaret said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was steady, but held an edge of righteous anger. "Victoria Prescott's life, her future, her good name, all were sacrificed for your greed and cowardice." Charles looked at Margaret as if truly seeing her for the first time. "Who are you?" "Someone who believes in justice," Margaret replied firmly. "Someone who thinks a man's character is revealed not by his family name or social standing, but by his actions when faced with consequences of his own making." Jonathan felt a surge of admiration for Margaret's courage and moral clarity. She had taken to this investigation with a natural aptitude that impressed him deeply, but more than that, her compassion for Victoria and her unflinching stance against injustice revealed a strength of character that matched her professional competence. "Mr. Whitmore, you have 2 choices," Jonathan said, drawing Charles's attention back to him. "You can come with us now to the police station and confess your crime, explaining how you took the bracelet and framed Victoria. You'll face theft charges and likely prison time, but you'll retain some dignity by doing the right thing. Or I can present my evidence to the police and the prosecutor, and you'll be arrested publicly, dragged through the scandal with no control over the narrative." "What difference does it make?" Charles asked bitterly. "Either way, I'm ruined." "The difference is in knowing you finally acted with honor," Margaret said gently, her nurse's instinct for human suffering tempering her anger. "The difference is in Victoria Prescott's immediate freedom rather than waiting for legal proceedings. The difference is in facing your aunt and your family with at least the courage to admit you're wrong." Charles looked between them, these 2 people who had unraveled his carefully constructed deception, and something in their combined moral certainty seemed to break through his self-pity. He nodded slowly. "I'll confess. You're right, miss. Victoria deserves her freedom immediately, not after more weeks of legal maneuvering. It's the least I can do after what I've put her through." The journey to the police station was tense, but unremarkable. Charles rode in Jonathan's hired carriage with Timothy, while Jonathan and Margaret followed in a separate conveyance. As the horses clip-clopped over the cobblestones, Margaret found herself trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. "You were magnificent," Jonathan said softly, taking her hand in his. The way you spoke to him, found the words that reached whatever decency remained in him. I've seen hardened criminals confess, but rarely with such apparent, genuine remorse. I simply spoke the truth, Margaret replied, though she was pleased by his praise. And I thought of Victoria, how terrified she must be, how helpless. If my words could shorten her ordeal even by hours, it was worth speaking them. Jonathan raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was old-fashioned, courtly, and it made Margaret's breath catch. When this is over, when Victoria is freed and Charles is processed, I'd like to speak with you about something important, something personal. Margaret's heart raced. I'd like that very much. At the police station, Jonathan's former colleagues greeted him with a mixture of surprise and respect. Detective Frank Morrison, a solid man in his 50s with a graying mustache, clasped Jonathan's hand warmly. Hartwell, we heard you nearly died from pneumonia. Good to see you on your feet again. Thanks to excellent nursing, Jonathan said, glancing at Margaret with unmistakable warmth. Frank, this is Miss Margaret Sullivan, who not only saved my life but assisted materially in solving the Bancroft case. Margaret, Detective Morrison, and I worked together for several years before I left the department. Margaret shook the detective's hand, noting his shrewd assessment of her and the knowing look that passed between him and Jonathan. A pleasure, Detective Morrison. The pleasure's mine, Miss Sullivan. And if Jonathan says you assisted in solving the case, I believe it. He always did have an eye for capable people. Morrison turned his attention to Charles Whitmore, who stood between two officers looking thoroughly defeated. Now, Mr. Whitmore, I understand you have a confession to make regarding the theft of Mrs. Helena Bancroft's diamond bracelet. Charles's confession was thorough and damning. He explained how his management of the Bancroft business affairs had resulted in significant losses through poor investments and some outright speculation. Desperate to cover his mistakes before the quarterly accounting that would reveal the shortfalls, he had stolen his aunt's bracelet during a family dinner at her home. He had taken it from her jewelry box while she was occupied with guests, knowing the theft wouldn't be discovered immediately, and that suspicion would naturally fall on Victoria, who had access to Mrs. Bancroft's private rooms. I told myself it wasn't really theft, that the bracelet was family property and would eventually be mine anyway through inheritance, Charles said, his voice hollow with shame. But I knew what I was doing. I knew Victoria would be blamed, and I did nothing to prevent her arrest. I convinced myself she would be found innocent, that surely the police would see the evidence was circumstantial. But as the days passed and the trial date approached, I realized she might actually be convicted, and still I said nothing. I was a coward. Margaret listened to the confession with mixed feelings. She was angry at Charles for his selfishness and the suffering he had caused, but she also recognized the courage it took to confess fully, knowing it meant his social and personal destruction. There was something profoundly human in his failure, a reminder that even decent people could make terrible choices when driven by fear and desperation. Detective Morrison processed the confession with efficient professionalism, but Margaret could see the disgust in his eyes. Mr. Whitmore, you'll be formally charged with grand larceny and making false statements to police. Officers will escort you to a holding cell while the paperwork is prepared. Miss Prescott will be released immediately and all charges against her dropped. As Charles was led away, Jonathan turned to Morrison. I'd like to be present when you inform Victoria of her release, if that's acceptable. She deserves to know that someone fought for her innocence. Of course, Morrison agreed. She's been a model prisoner, dignified and insistent on her innocence despite all evidence suggesting otherwise. It'll be my pleasure to tell her she's free. And Hartwell, good work on this. Clean, thorough investigation with a confession to seal it. You haven't lost your touch. I had exceptional assistance, Jonathan said, his eyes finding Margaret's once again. I couldn't have solved this case without Miss Sullivan's help, both in nursing me back to health and in conducting crucial investigative work. Morrison's eyebrows rose appreciatively. A woman of many talents, then. You're fortunate, Hartwell, in more ways than one, I suspect. Victoria Prescott was brought from the women's section of the jail a short time later, escorted by a matron. She was a slender young woman of perhaps 23, with light brown hair pulled back severely, and eyes that held both fear and defiant hope. Her simple gray dress was wrinkled from days of wear, but she carried herself with dignity that prison had not diminished. Miss Prescott, Detective Morrison began gently, his gruff demeanor softening in the face of her obvious anxiety. "I have excellent news. Charles Whitmore has confessed to stealing Mrs. Bancroft's bracelet and allowing you to be falsely accused. All charges against you are dropped effective immediately. You're free to go." Victoria's knees buckled, and Margaret instinctively moved forward to support her, guiding her to a nearby chair. The young woman's face had gone pale with shock, tears streaming down her cheeks, as the reality of her freedom crashed over her. "He confessed?" Victoria whispered, her voice breaking. "Charles? But why would he let me suffer for so long if he knew the truth?" "Fear and selfishness," Jonathan said quietly, kneeling beside her chair so he could meet her eyes at her level. "I'm Jonathan Hartwell, the private detective your attorney hired to investigate your case. Charles was desperate to cover financial losses and made a terrible choice, then compounded it by allowing an innocent woman to bear the consequences. But he did finally find the courage to confess, and you're free now. That's what matters." Victoria looked at Jonathan with an expression of such profound gratitude that Margaret felt her own eyes misting with tears. "How can I ever thank you, Mr. Hartwell? I was so frightened. The trial was next week, and my attorney said the evidence was difficult to overcome. I prayed every night for a miracle, and you're the answer to those prayers. Thank Miss Sullivan as well," Jonathan said, gesturing to Margaret. "She conducted crucial investigative work while I was recovering from illness. Without her courage and intelligence, we might not have gathered the evidence in time." Victoria turned to Margaret, reaching out to clasp her hands. "Thank you. Thank you both. You've given me my life back, my reputation, my future. I can never repay such a debt. Live well and happily," Margaret said softly, squeezing Victoria's hands. "That's all the repayment necessary. You've suffered unjustly, but you've also shown remarkable strength and dignity. Don't let this experience embitter you. You have your whole life ahead of you." Detective Morrison cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the emotional scene but not unmoved by it. "Miss Prescott, you're free to leave whenever you're ready. Your personal effects will be returned to you. Is there someone we can send for to escort you home?" "My sister," Victoria said, wiping her tears with trembling fingers. "Emily attends teaching college in Philadelphia, but she came to Boston when I was arrested. She's staying at a boarding house on Cambridge Street. If someone could send word to her, I know she'd come immediately." "I'll see to it personally," Morrison promised. "In the meantime, you're welcome to wait in my office where it's more comfortable." As Victoria was led away by the matron to collect her belongings, Jonathan and Margaret found themselves alone in a quiet corner of the station. The afternoon was fading into evening, the November darkness coming early and complete. Gas lamps flickered to life throughout the building, casting warm pools of light against the encroaching cold. "It's over," Margaret said softly, feeling suddenly exhausted now that the urgency of the investigation had passed. "Victoria is free, justice is served, and your case is successfully concluded." "Yes," Jonathan agreed, but his tone suggested his thoughts had moved beyond the case. "Margaret, when I said I wanted to speak with you about something personal, I meant it. These past days working alongside you, I've come to realize something important." Margaret's heart began to race as Jonathan took both her hands in his storm-colored eyes intense with emotion. Around them, the police station continued its routine business, but in their quiet corner, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. "When I was delirious with fever, I heard your voice," Jonathan continued, his voice low and earnest. "I couldn't always understand the words, but I felt your presence, your determination that I would recover. You were a lifeline pulling me back from the darkness, and when I finally woke and saw you, I knew I was looking at someone extraordinary, someone I didn't want to leave once I was well." "Jonathan," Margaret breathed, her voice catching with emotion. "Please, let me finish," he said gently. "These days recovering in your care, then working together on Victoria's case, I've seen your courage, your compassion, your brilliant mind and generous heart. You're unlike any woman I've ever known. You're independent and capable, yet also kind and caring. You face life on your own terms with a strength I deeply admire." Margaret felt tears pricking her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I felt it too," she confessed. "From that first moment when Timothy brought you to my door, there was something. I told myself it was simply professional concern, a nurse's dedication to her patient. But as the days passed, as we talked and worked together, I realized it was so much more. You see me, Jonathan. Truly see me. Not just as a nurse or a woman alone, but as a whole person with thoughts and abilities and worth. Jonathan raised one hand to cup her cheek tenderly, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. I'm not a wealthy man, Margaret. My detective work provides a comfortable living, but nothing extravagant, and my profession carries certain dangers, uncertainties that another man in a more conventional occupation wouldn't face. But I would be honored, deeply honored, if you would consider allowing me to court you properly, to explore this connection between us, and see if it might lead to something permanent. Margaret's smile broke through her tears like sunshine through clouds. I don't care about wealth, Jonathan. I have my own profession, my own means of support. And as for danger, I think these past days have proven I'm not averse to a little risk when the cause is just. Yes, I would very much like for you to court me properly. I would like to continue working alongside you on cases where I might be helpful. I would like to build something together, a partnership of equals. A partnership of equals, Jonathan repeated, his own smile matching hers. I can think of nothing I'd want more. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away, if she wished. But Margaret remained still, her eyes fluttering closed as his lips met hers, in a kiss that was both gentle and filled with promise. It was a kiss that spoke of new beginnings, of two solitary people finding unexpected connection, of healing and hope and the courage to reach for happiness. When they finally drew apart, both slightly breathless, Jonathan rested his forehead against hers. You've saved me twice now, Margaret Sullivan. Once from fever, and now from loneliness I didn't even realize I'd been living with. And you've shown me that my life doesn't have to be only duty and solitude, Margaret replied softly. That I can have purpose and partnership, work and love, all together. They were interrupted by Detective Morrison's amused cough. Hate to intrude on a private moment, but Miss Prescott's sister has arrived, and I thought you might want to witness the reunion. Jonathan and Margaret stepped apart reluctantly, though Jonathan kept hold of Margaret's hand as they followed Morrison to his office. There they found Victoria embracing a young woman who could only be her sister, the two of them crying and laughing simultaneously with the relief of nightmare's end. Emily Prescott was younger than Victoria, perhaps 20, with the same gentle features and kind eyes. When she looked up and saw Jonathan and Margaret, her face lit with gratitude. You're the detective who saved my sister, Emily said, moving forward to clasp Jonathan's free hand while Victoria held his other one. And you must be Miss Sullivan. Victoria just told me how you both worked to prove her innocence. We can never thank you enough. Our family has so little, but whatever we have is yours if you should ever need it. Your sister's freedom is thanks enough, Jonathan assured her. Just promise me you'll both be cautious about whom you trust in the future. Not everyone with a respectable name and pleasant manner has honorable intentions. A lesson learned most painfully. Victoria agreed, though her voice held no bitterness. But I'm determined not to let this experience make me cynical or fearful. I'll be wiser, certainly, but I refuse to close my heart to hope and trust entirely. Margaret squeezed Jonathan's hand, thinking how Victoria's words might apply to them as well. They had both been solitary, both learned to rely only on themselves, but now they were choosing to trust, to hope, to build something together despite the risks such vulnerability entailed. The Prescott sisters departed shortly after, Emily supporting Victoria's still shaky steps as they left to return to their boarding house. Detective Morrison walked Jonathan and Margaret out of the station as the evening deepened into full night. I meant what I said earlier, Hartwell, Morrison said as they stood on the station steps, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. You haven't lost your touch. If you ever want to return to the department, there'd be a place for you. We need good men who care about justice more than politics. I appreciate that, Frank, but I'm content with my independence, Jonathan replied, though I might occasionally have information to share or request assistance on cases that intersect with official investigations. Always welcome, Morrison assured him. Then he turned to Margaret with a knowing smile. Miss Sullivan, I have a feeling we'll be seeing more of you as well. Hartwell always did have excellent judgment in people. I wish you both very happy. As Morrison returned inside, Jonathan turned to Margaret. May I escort you home? It's late, and these streets aren't entirely safe after dark. I'd like that, Margaret said, accepting his offered arm. They walked slowly through the gaslit streets, in no hurry to end the evening despite the cold. The city around them was settling into its nighttime rhythms, shops closing, restaurants filling with diners, the clatter of horses and carriages providing a constant backdrop. "When I first became ill," Jonathan said as they walked, "I remember thinking it was the worst possible timing. The Bancroft case was at a critical point, and I was frustrated by my body's betrayal. But now I see it differently. If I hadn't collapsed, if Timothy hadn't brought me to your door, we might never have met. You might have remained the unknown nurse in the building I passed daily, and I would have continued my solitary existence, not even realizing what I was missing." "I've thought the same thing," Margaret admitted. "I was content with my life, or so I believed. But contentment isn't the same as happiness, is it? I had purpose and independence, but I was also lonely without quite admitting it to myself. You've shown me that I can have everything I value about my current life, while also having companionship, partnership, even love." They reached Margaret's building on Beacon Hill, the familiar brownstone now forever changed in significance as the place where their story had begun. At her door, Jonathan took both her hands again, his expression serious. "I want to do this properly, Margaret. I know modern thinking suggests longer courtships aren't always necessary, but I want to give you time to be certain of your feelings, to make sure this isn't simply gratitude or the excitement of the investigation influencing your judgment." Margaret appreciated his consideration, even as she felt certain of her own heart. "Then we'll take our time and do this properly. But Jonathan, I already know my feelings are real. I'm a nurse. I've cared for dozens of patients, felt concern and compassion for all of them, but never once have I felt what I feel with you. This is different, and I know the difference." "As do I," Jonathan agreed. "But we'll still be patient. Allow our relationship to develop naturally. I'll call on you tomorrow if you're agreeable. Perhaps we could take a walk in the public garden if the weather holds. I'd like to court you in daylight as well as crisis." Margaret laughed softly at his phrasing. "I'd enjoy that very much, though I confess I'm already anticipating the next case where I might assist you. I've discovered I have quite a taste for investigation." "Then we'll make it official," Jonathan said with a smile. "Hartwell Investigations can use a skilled associate. Your nursing background provides excellent cover for inquiries, and your instincts are remarkably sound. Of course, I'll only involve you in cases where the danger is minimal." "We'll discuss that condition," Margaret said with mock severity. "I'm not a porcelain doll to be protected from all risk. But yes, I'd be honored to work with you officially." Jonathan raised her hands to his lips once more, kissing each in turn with old-fashioned gallantry that made Margaret's heart flutter. "Until tomorrow then, Miss Sullivan." "Until tomorrow, Mr. Hartwell," Margaret replied, her eyes sparkling with happiness. She watched from her window as Jonathan walked away into the night, his tall figure confident and strong, fully recovered from the illness that had brought them together. In just over a week, her entire life had transformed from solitary routine to exciting possibility. She had saved a life, solved a crime, freed an innocent woman, and found love with a remarkable man who saw her as an equal partner. Margaret moved through her small apartment, lighting lamps and stoking the fire against the November chill. Everything looked the same as it had a week ago, yet everything felt different, charged with new meaning and promise. On her sofa, where Jonathan had lain near death, she saw not illness, but the beginning of healing, both physical and emotional. At her table, where they had studied case files together, she saw the foundation of a partnership that would grow and deepen. She prepared for bed that night with a lightness in her heart she hadn't felt in years, perhaps ever. Her parents' death had forced her to become strong and independent, to build a life through her own efforts and determination. She had never regretted that path, but she had also never imagined she could maintain her independence while also sharing her life with someone else. Jonathan understood that distinction. He admired her strength rather than feeling threatened by it. He wanted her as a partner in his work as well as his life, and most importantly, he saw her, truly saw her, as a complete person with value beyond what she could provide for others. Across the city, Jonathan returned to his own apartment with similar feelings. He had built a successful detective agency, earned respect for his investigative skills, and helped numerous clients find justice. But he had also been lonely, though he rarely admitted it even to himself. His work had become his entire existence, leaving no room for personal connections or the vulnerability that came with caring deeply for another person. Margaret had changed that with her courage, intelligence, and generous heart. She had saved his life and then immediately proven herself an invaluable partner in his work. But more than that, she had made him want something beyond his next case, beyond the satisfaction of solving puzzles and uncovering truth. She made him want a home, a future, someone to share both triumphs and setbacks with. He sat at his desk and opened his journal, a habit he had maintained since his police academy days. In neat handwriting, he documented the conclusion of the Bancroft case, but his final entry was personal rather than professional. "Today, I met the woman I'm going to marry," he wrote. "Her name is Margaret Sullivan, and she is extraordinary in every way. I don't know how long our courtship will last or what obstacles we might face, but I know with absolute certainty that she is the partner I've been searching for without realizing it. Life, it seems, has a sense of humor and timing. My illness, which seemed such a catastrophe, was actually the greatest fortune. It brought me to Margaret's door and gave me the chance to know her, to see her strength and compassion and brilliant mind. Whatever the future holds, I'm grateful for this unexpected gift." The following months proved Jonathan's instincts correct. His courtship of Margaret proceeded with proper Victorian decorum in public, with chaperoned walks and carefully timed visits, but their private conversations during investigations revealed the deep compatibility and growing love between them. Margaret assisted on several cases, her nursing background providing access to situations and information that would have been difficult for Jonathan to obtain alone. In late February of 1899, on a snowy afternoon in the public garden, where winter had transformed the landscape into a wonderland of white, Jonathan proposed to Margaret with a simple but elegant ring. She accepted without hesitation, and they married that spring in a small ceremony attended by close friends, including Detective Morrison, Timothy Walsh, and Victoria Prescott, with her sister Emily. Margaret continued her nursing work, but she also became an official partner in Hartwell investigations, her name added to the agency's door. Together they built a reputation for taking on cases others wouldn't touch, fighting for clients who had nowhere else to turn, finding justice when conventional channels failed. Their partnership was unconventional for the era, a marriage of equals who worked side by side, but it was also deeply happy. They shared not just a home but a purpose, not just affection but respect and admiration. They faced dangers together, celebrated victories together, and supported each other through setbacks and disappointments. Years later, when asked about their unusual love story, Margaret would smile and say, "I nursed him through fever, then read his name in the morning newspapers when his case made headlines. I saved his life, and he gave mine new meaning. We found each other in crisis and built something beautiful from that chaos." And Jonathan would add, his hand finding hers automatically, "She showed me that strength and love aren't opposites, that I could have a partner without giving up my independence, that life is richer shared than lived alone. The fever brought me to her door, but everything that followed was a choice we made together." Their story became something of a legend in Boston's detective circles, a reminder that sometimes the most profound connections come from unexpected circumstances, that love can be found in the most unlikely moments, and that true partnership requires both people to be fully themselves while also being fully committed to each other. Victoria Prescott, freed from false accusation and able to reclaim her life, never forgot the couple who had fought for her innocence. She eventually became a teacher like her sister, dedicating her life to educating young women about their rights and worth. She often told her students about Margaret and Jonathan, using their story to illustrate that integrity, courage, and the willingness to fight for justice could change lives and create unexpected beauty from crisis. The Bancroft case remained one of Jonathan's most satisfying victories, not just because justice was served, but because it had given him Margaret. It had taken illness and investigation, fever and determination, crisis and courage, but in the end, two solitary people had found each other and built something neither could have achieved alone. A partnership of equals, a love based on mutual respect and admiration, and a shared commitment to making their corner of the world a little more just. As the years passed and their reputation grew, Margaret and Jonathan Hartwell became known throughout Boston and beyond as detectives who never gave up, who saw value in every client regardless of their station, and who proved that marriage and professional partnership could coexist beautifully when built on foundation of equality and genuine respect. Their story, beginning with fever and ending in love, remained a testament to the unexpected ways life could change, to the courage required to trust another person completely, and to the profound truth that sometimes the best things come from the worst circumstances, if we have the wisdom to recognize the gift when it appears.